Good evening. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger. I was wrong. Tonight, let me tell you about a man I saw sitting quietly at a gate before one of my own flights, and what happened when a general walked up and saluted him first. Elijah Sampson sat in a worn gray cardigan and plain khakis near Gate 22 at Hartsfield-Jackson, a paperback novel open in his lap, a small canvas duffel resting between his scuffed brown shoes. He was 74 years old, silver-haired, unremarkable in every visible way to the hundreds of travelers moving past him that morning, the kind of quiet, still presence people's eyes slide right over in a crowded terminal without ever quite landing, the way a bench or a pillar becomes part of the scenery after the first glance. He'd arrived 3 hours early, the way he always did, a habit built from decades of a life where being early wasn't optional, where a man who showed up late carried consequences that reached far beyond his own inconvenience. He read slowly, deliberately, the same way he did everything now that he had the luxury of time, a luxury that had taken him most of his adult life to earn the right to enjoy without guilt. Nobody around him had any reason to look twice, and for most of that morning, nobody did. He'd chosen the cardigan deliberately that morning, the same way he chose most of his clothes these days, for comfort rather than impression, a habit that had taken him years to fully embrace after decades of pressed uniforms and inspected boots. There was a kind of freedom in it he still hadn't gotten used to, the freedom of simply existing in a room without a rank pinned to his chest, telling everyone exactly how much attention he was owed. A maintenance cart sat parked near the wall behind him, left there by an airport custodian who'd stepped away to handle a spill in the food court, a yellow caution sign propped beside it, the kind of ordinary airport clutter nobody registers until it becomes convenient shorthand for a story someone's already decided to tell themselves. When a businessman named Carl Whitfield approached the gate a few minutes later, laptop bag over one shoulder, phone pressed to his ear, he glanced at Elijah, glanced at the cart, and drew the kind of quick, careless conclusion people draw when they're not really looking at anything, just filling in a story with the fastest available explanation, the one that required the least effort to believe. "Excuse me," Carl said, lowering his phone for just a moment, not quite covering the mouthpiece. "Is this your cart? I need someone to grab this spilled coffee before my flight boards. It's right by Gate 21. Elijah looked up slowly from his book, taking in the man's expression, understanding immediately and completely what conclusion had been drawn about him, an assumption he'd encountered more times over the decades than he could accurately count, one that had followed him from his earliest days as a young officer, straight through to this exact bench, in this exact terminal. He didn't argue. He didn't correct him. He simply closed his book around one finger to hold his place and said evenly, "That's not my cart." Carl barely registered the answer, already turning back to his phone call, waving a hand as if the specifics didn't much matter to him either way. "Well, could you let someone know? Thanks." He walked off without waiting for a response, and Elijah watched him go, unbothered in the particular way that only comes from a lifetime of practice, then returned to his book, the page finding him again without any real effort at all. A gate agent named Melissa Foster, new to the airline and only 4 months into the job, had watched the exchange from her podium without fully understanding what she was seeing, too focused on her own growing list of boarding announcements to think much about a passenger and a cart. When a spilled drink near her own gate started drawing complaints a short while later, she scanned the area, spotted the maintenance cart, then spotted Elijah sitting nearby in his plain cardigan, and made the same quick, careless leap Carl had made minutes earlier, the two of them arriving at the exact same wrong conclusion without ever comparing notes. She approached him directly, professional but brisk, the tone she'd use with any airport employee she didn't personally know. "Sir, when you get a chance, there's a spill over by Gate 21 that needs attention. Passengers keep stepping in it." Elijah set his book down fully this time, folding his hands over the cover. "I don't work for the airport, ma'am. I'm a passenger, same as everyone else here." Melissa's cheeks colored slightly, embarrassment flickering across her face before professionalism smoothed it back over. "Oh, I'm sorry, I just assumed, with the cart there and—" She stopped herself, not quite finishing the sentence, unsure how to explain a conclusion that suddenly sounded worse out loud than it had felt in her head a moment earlier. "It's all right," Elijah said, and meant it, no edge in his voice at all. Just the calm of a man who'd made peace with this particular pattern of the world a long time ago, decades before this specific gate agent had even been born. "Cart makes it an easy mistake." She apologized once more, called the actual custodian back over the radio, and returned to her podium, the whole exchange lasting under a minute, forgettable to nearly everyone who witnessed it except for the two people directly involved and one observer 3 seats down, who couldn't quite shake the discomfort of what she'd just watched. That observer was a young woman named Priya Doshi, a graduate student flying home for the holidays, who'd watched both exchanges with a growing discomfort she couldn't quite name at first. She'd noticed the way both Carl and Melissa had looked at Elijah, not with malice exactly, just with the kind of fast, unconscious sorting that happens before conscious thought ever gets involved, the sorting that decided, in half a second, which people in a room were worth a second look and which were furniture to be worked around. She almost said something. She didn't, telling herself it wasn't her place, that Elijah seemed unbothered anyway, that speaking up might embarrass him more than help him, a rationalization that felt reasonable in the moment, and less so the longer she sat with it afterward. She'd think about that decision later, once she understood exactly who she'd watched sit quietly through two small, careless insults without a single word of complaint. What none of them knew, because Elijah Sampson had never once in 40 years made a habit of announcing it to strangers, was that he had retired 11 years earlier as a 4-star general in the United States Army, one of only a small handful of black officers to ever reach that rank. A career spanning 38 years that included 2 combat deployments, a command position overseeing an entire theater of operations, and a Distinguished Service Medal he kept in a drawer at home, rather than displayed on any wall where a visitor might ask about it. He'd learned early in his career, as a young lieutenant fresh out of officer training, exactly how often his uniform did the explaining that his presence alone apparently couldn't, and exactly how quickly that explaining disappeared the moment the uniform came off, and he became once again simply a man other people felt entitled to categorize on sight. He'd made his peace with it decades ago, not because it didn't sting, because it always stung at least a little, but because he'd decided a long time ago that correcting every small assumption a stranger made about him would cost him more energy than he was willing to spend on people who'd forget the exchange within the hour anyway. He wasn't traveling that morning for anything related to his old career. He was flying to Charleston for the funeral of Corporal Danny Reyes, a young soldier who'd served under his command decades earlier during his final deployment, a soldier who'd stayed in touch with him faithfully every single year since, sending a Christmas card without fail, calling on his birthday, treating Elijah less like a retired commanding officer and more like the closest thing to a father he'd had after losing his own to cancer at 17. Danny had passed away 2 weeks earlier, a heart condition nobody had caught in time, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children Elijah had watched grow up through photographs mailed twice a year, each envelope arriving right on schedule, regardless of where either man happened to be living at the time. Elijah still remembered the first time he'd met Danny, a nervous 19-year-old private who'd showed up to his first deployment with a stutter he was ashamed of and a work ethic nobody had to ask twice about. Elijah had spent extra time with him in those early months, not out of any particular obligation, just because something in the young man reminded him of himself at that age, hungry to prove something to a world that hadn't yet decided whether it would give him the chance. Elijah hadn't told the airline, the gate agent, or a single stranger in that terminal why he was traveling, or who he'd been before he'd traded his uniform for a gray cardigan. He simply sat with his book, waiting the way he always waited, 3 hours early, patient, present, entirely unremarkable to anyone who didn't already know him, carrying grief quietly the same way he carried everything else. What he also didn't know yet was that Danny's unit, the same unit Elijah had commanded years earlier, had arranged for an active-duty honor guard to meet the family in Charleston, and that the officer leading that detail had specifically requested to be at the Atlanta airport that morning as well, having learned through a mutual contact that General Sampson would be passing through Gate 22 on his way to the same funeral, and having decided, without a second thought, that meeting him there mattered. Colonel Rachel Ortiz walked into the gate area 20 minutes before boarding, dressed in her Army service uniform, her posture unmistakable even from a distance, the particular bearing of someone who'd spent her entire adult life being trained to occupy space with total intention, every movement carrying purpose. She scanned the gate area methodically, the way she scanned any room out of long habit, and found exactly who she was looking for within seconds, sitting quietly in a gray cardigan near the window, a paperback open in his lap, exactly as unremarkable to everyone else as he'd been all morning. She crossed the terminal directly, passengers instinctively clearing a path for the uniform without quite registering why, some old automatic deference kicking in before conscious thought caught up to it. She came to a stop in front of Elijah's seat, snapped to attention, and rendered a crisp, formal salute, her voice carrying clearly across the entire gate area, sharp enough that conversations 2 rows away trailed off mid-sentence. "General Sampson, sir." The terminal seemed to pause for a half-second, conversations trailing off, heads turning toward the sound of a title that didn't match anything about the quiet man in the worn cardigan sitting near the window, a title that seemed to belong to someone else entirely, someone who certainly wasn't sitting there in scuffed brown shoes, reading a paperback. Elijah closed his book, stood slowly, and returned the salute with the same effortless precision that 38 years of habit had carved permanently into his muscle memory, a gesture that looked, even now, completely natural on him, as though his body had never once forgotten it despite 11 years of civilian life. "Colonel Ortiz," he said warmly, lowering his hand. "At ease. It's good to see you." "You as well, sir." Rachel's voice softened slightly, the formality easing into something closer to genuine warmth, the professional distance giving way to something that felt almost like family. "The unit wanted to make sure someone was here to meet you before Charleston. Corporal Reyes talked about you often, sir, more than you probably know." Carl Whitfield, still standing nearby, waiting for his own flight, went visibly pale, his phone lowering slowly from his ear as the pieces rearranged themselves in his head with uncomfortable speed, the coffee spill and the careless wave of his hand suddenly replaying themselves in a completely different light. Melissa Foster froze completely at her podium, her hand still resting on the boarding announcement microphone she'd been about to use. The words, "Sir," and "General," landing somewhere she clearly hadn't expected them to, somewhere that made her stomach drop with the specific weight of having gotten something badly wrong in front of an entire gate full of strangers. Priyadoshi watched the exchange from 3 seats down with something close to disbelief, replaying the last hour in her head, the spilled coffee, the maintenance cart, the 2 small assumptions she'd watched land on a man who'd absorbed each one without a flicker of complaint, sitting there with a patience she was only now beginning to fully understand the cost of. She understood now exactly what she'd been watching, and exactly why she'd felt so uneasy about staying silent, a discomfort that suddenly made complete sense in hindsight. Colonel Ortiz spent a few minutes with Elijah, quietly reviewing details about the Charleston ceremony, confirming arrangements for the honor guard, her tone shifting easily between formal briefing and something more personal, the clear affection of someone who'd served under a commander she genuinely respected, the kind of respect that didn't fade just because the uniform did. When she finally excused herself to coordinate with the gate crew about priority boarding, she offered one more crisp salute, which Elijah returned just as precisely, and then the terminal slowly resumed its ordinary noise, though something in the air around Gate 22 had noticeably shifted, a quiet ripple of recalibration moving through everyone who'd witnessed it. Melissa approached Elijah first, her earlier composure completely gone, replaced by genuine mortification. "General Sampson, I am so sorry. I had no idea. I never should have assumed." Elijah held up a gentle hand, cutting off the apology before it could fully form. "You made an honest mistake, ma'am. There was a cart, and I was sitting near it. I've been mistaken for a lot of things in my life. It's all right." "It's not, though," Melissa said, her voice tightening, something in her refusing to accept the easy way out he was offering her. "I looked at you and decided you were the help before I ever asked your name. That's not about the cart." Elijah studied her for a moment, something in his expression softening at the honesty in that admission, the willingness to name the real thing instead of hiding behind the convenient excuse that would have let her off easier. "No," he said quietly, "it's not. But you just corrected yourself out loud, in front of a room full of strangers, without me asking you to. That matters more than you might think." Carl Whitfield approached more hesitantly, clearly wrestling with whether to say anything at all, his earlier bravado on the phone nowhere in evidence now. When he finally did, his voice came out smaller than the confident tone he'd used on the phone an hour earlier, almost unrecognizable as the same man. "General, I'm sorry about earlier. I shouldn't have assumed you worked for the airport." "You were in a hurry," Elijah said simply, no bitterness in it. "People make quick decisions when they're in a hurry. I'd ask you to just slow down next time is all. Look at people a little longer before you decide who they are." Carl nodded, something in his posture loosening slightly, and lingered a moment longer than necessary, as though he wanted to say something else but couldn't quite find the words for it. Eventually, he simply extended his hand, and Elijah shook it. No lingering resentment in the gesture at all, just the closing of a small, ordinary chapter between 2 strangers who happened to cross paths in an airport that morning. Boarding began a few minutes later, and Colonel Ortiz made sure Elijah was seated comfortably before the general boarding call, walking him personally to the jet bridge, the 2 of them talking quietly about Danny Reyes, about the family he'd left behind, about a soldier who'd never once forgotten the man who'd looked out for him decades earlier in a place far from home. She told him, in the last few steps before the jet bridge door, that half the unit had wanted to fly down themselves, that Danny's stories about their old commanding officer had become something close to legend among the younger soldiers who'd never met him, a quiet hero they'd only ever heard about secondhand. I watched all of this unfold from near my own gate that morning, waiting for my own flight, and I found myself thinking about how little that terminal had actually needed to change its assumptions about Elijah Sampson, if only people had taken an extra second before deciding who he was. He never once raised his voice, never once demanded the correction he was owed. He simply waited, the same patient way he'd been waiting his whole life, for people to eventually see what had been sitting right in front of them the entire time, unhurried, in a way that most of us, myself included, could probably stand to learn something from. In Charleston, the honor guard met the family at the airport, 7 soldiers in dress uniform, standing at attention as Elijah stepped off the jet bridge, a formality that would have embarrassed a lesser man and simply steadied this one instead. He stood beside Danny Reyes's widow at the funeral 2 days later, not as a general, not as anyone's superior officer, just as a man who'd promised a young soldier decades earlier that he'd always be there if it mattered, and who'd kept that promise all the way to the end. He held her hand through the service and told her stories about her husband she'd never heard before, small moments from deployment that had shaped the man she'd married, the kind of stories only a commanding officer who genuinely cared could tell, delivered with the same quiet steadiness he'd carried through that entire morning at Gate 22. Danny's 2 children, 6 and 9 years old, sat close to Elijah during the reception afterward, and he spent nearly an hour with them, not talking about their father's death, but about the man their father had been before either of them could remember much of anything. The jokes he told, the way he'd once carried an entire platoon's morale on his shoulders during a rough stretch overseas, simply by refusing to stop smiling. It was, Elijah told a colleague later, the most important work he'd done in years, more important by far than any medal sitting quietly in that drawer back home. Melissa Foster requested additional training for her team the following week, not because anyone required it of her, but because the exchange at Gate 22 had stayed with her longer than she expected, replaying itself in her mind during quiet moments at her podium for days afterward. She wanted her crew to learn to look a little longer before deciding who deserved their attention and who didn't, and she said as much, plainly, in the training request she submitted to her supervisor, describing exactly what had happened without softening any part of it for her own comfort. Priya Doshi wrote about the encounter in a journal she kept for exactly these kinds of moments, small instances that taught her more about the world than most of her formal education ever had, closing the entry with a single line she'd remember for years afterward. Some of the most important people in any room are the ones nobody bothers to really look at. She'd think of that line often in the years that followed, in classrooms, in job interviews, in every room where she caught herself sorting people too quickly. I never learned whether Carl Whitfield changed anything about how he moved through the world after that morning. Some people do. Some people forget by the time they've boarded their next flight, the discomfort fading somewhere over the first hour of cruising altitude. But I like to think that somewhere in the back of his mind, the next time he looked at a stranger and reached for the fastest, easiest explanation, he paused, just for a second, and looked a little longer instead, the way a quiet man in a gray cardigan had once, without ever raising his voice, taught an entire gate full of strangers to do. Danny Reyes's widow told Elijah, near the end of the reception, that her husband used to say the general had a way of making a person feel seen without ever making a show of it, and that she finally understood exactly what he'd meant after watching him spend an hour on the floor with her children, instead of standing off to the side, accepting condolences like most dignitaries would have. It was, she said, exactly the kind of thing her husband would have wanted her to notice. At 35,000 feet, everyone wears the same seatbelt. It's character, not appearance, that truly tells you who someone is. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. Thanks for flying with me tonight. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's another flight waiting.